Hi, Anna.
Hey, Shay.
How are you?
Hanging in there.
Ooh, nice expression. Hanging in there.
It's a good one.
English, well, any language really has some great expressions.
I see where you're going.
And these expressions, words, lexical chunks, these are at the heart of teaching and learning a language.
But while building vocabulary might seem like a cakewalk, a walk in the park,
Hmm.
maybe even something that just happens over time, even though it may seem simple, it's worth giving more thought to vocabulary acquisition since it's something that's crucial for language learners of all levels. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Anna.
And I'm Shay. And today we're going to get into all things vocabulary.
Individual lexical items, collocations.
Words.
Indeed. So, Shay, when you think of what it means to teach vocabulary, where does your mind go?
Well, instead, I want to counter your question with another question. What does it mean to learn vocabulary?
Good question. So let's step back a little. What does it mean to know a word? I think all or most language teachers are familiar with the concepts of receptive and productive knowledge.
Right. First, students recognize words and understand the meaning of a lexical item.
That's receptive knowledge.
So, receptive knowledge means if you hear or read the word, you understand it. But from there, that passive recognition, to truly know a word, you need to be able to use it in the appropriate context.
And that's productive knowledge. The learner is actively using the new vocabulary. They demonstrate true knowledge of a term by using it themselves, producing utterances that use the word in context, a new context that they themselves have created.
Right.
So those moments of productive language use really tell us teachers that the student got it, that they moved beyond passive recognition and started to utilize the new language in their own production. I think that's how we have to think of vocabulary knowledge because that's what is ultimately going to serve our students best.
Yes. And while the recognition of words and phrases is worth celebrating for sure, without crossing the production threshold, our students are limited in their role as recipients of language. And that's not what we want. We want to give them all the tools they need to come into both communicative roles in an exchange.
So then the question of how we get them to that place surfaces. And here there are really two approaches that create the foundation for teaching vocabulary: explicit and implicit approaches.
Yep. Implicit learning basically means the learner isn't really aware of the learning taking place. They're not conscious of the fact that they're learning new vocabulary. Like, for example, if a word shows up 10 times in a chapter of a book, odds are that through reading and rereading it in context, eventually they'll be able to infer its meaning and add it to their repertoire of words, at least to some extent. I'm sure that's happened to you before.
Oh, yeah. And this happens especially when you read a lot about a very specific topic or when a certain word is repeated over and over again in the text you're reading or the podcast you're listening to.
Yeah. So we've mentioned two approaches to implicit learning. Narrow reading, that's when you read or have your students read or listen to a lot of input around the same narrow topic. And then you mentioned when a word is repeated over and over, that's called input flooding. So as a teacher, you can alter the text you assign to your students so that the word, it could be a lexical chunk, like an expression. If you've engineered the text so that the word pops up over and over, students will likely absorb it without even knowing it.
Sneaky. And it's not just through reading, it can be listening. I've been working with a lot of native Spanish speakers lately, and I've never taken a Spanish course in my life, but there are just some words I've picked up on whenever they're speaking Spanish with each other. Like pregunta doesn't sound anything like the word for question in any of the languages I speak, but hearing it over and over again in context has led me to learn it.
Nice. Pregunta. That's a great example of implicit learning.
Another implicit approach that came to mind for me while you were talking is input enhancement. Like when you underline or highlight certain words in a passage so that learners notice them, make note that it's something to be remembered.
Yeah, there's a lot of value to noticing in language acquisition, and tweaking the way a text is presented visually can contribute a lot to that. But I'd say that all of these strategies, they might lead to some level of incidental learning, right? Learning that is
Mm.
focused on understanding meaning instead of explicitly learning new words. Yes, that's good. But I'd argue that these strategies alone are not enough to lead to that full productive knowledge we're looking for.
Of course, totally agree.
One common way to tie implicit teaching strategies to explicit learning is inference,
Mm.
activities that ask students to infer the meaning of a word. What can the learner gather from the word form, the part of speech? Can the learner guess the meaning of a new word from the context? This moves the learner from recognition to beginning to approach new vocabulary with a more critical eye, moving from merely highlighting the word to starting to try to understand what it means. Notice how it's used.
And then, of course, after some inference attempts, the teacher shares the meaning of the word and how it's used, etc.
Right. This strategy is useful because it fuses elements of implicit teaching with a form of explicit follow up.
Yes, a cocktail of both implicit and explicit approaches.
Oh, a cocktail sounds nice. Another recipe for this explicit implicit cocktail is.
And by a recipe for a cocktail, we mean
Oops.
strategy.
Oh, yes. Another strategy is to have students work individually or in pairs or in groups, not to infer the meaning necessarily, but to use the dictionary to look up the word.
Yeah, right. If inferencing doesn't work, have them use an English only or target language only dictionary. That process of looking up a word, reading through all of its definitions, finding the definition that works best for your context, that's a super useful practice.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't necessarily have to be done while reading. It can be front loaded too. Like the teacher has a list of terms that learners need to discuss a specific topic or understand some written or oral input. And so he gives that list to the students and they have to look up their meanings with examples.
Yeah, so that's a much more explicit approach.
The teacher could even provide the definitions herself. How a teacher introduces new key vocabulary with the start of a new unit, maybe explicitly sharing the words and their meanings with the learners. This approach ensures that learners will be prepared with the necessary language to engage with a concept.
One of my favorite ways to front load vocabulary is through image association, especially with lower levels. When you introduce a term or expression, you can also introduce an image that connects with it to some degree. That visual association can help students map the meaning of the word to a concept they're familiar with.
Like if I show a picture of a pyramid when teaching the word hierarchy.
Yeah, it helps explain the concept and adds a visual representation to the semantic concept.
Another thing that I rely on pretty heavily for pre-teaching vocabulary is mind maps, both at the semantic and morphological level. So focusing on semantics, I might ask students to come up with words that are close in meaning to one another, getting them to brainstorm synonyms or words that are semantically connected, like house and abode and hut and flat. Having them create associations between terms in a visual way, categorizing new and familiar vocabulary together helps aid in remembering.
I like that because it helps to increase learners' confidence and show them how much language they already have to work with. Plus, it attaches the meaning of the word to already familiar meanings.
Exactly. Or maybe we'll do clustering, where I'll have them generate words that have the same root, but different parts of speech, getting them to see how the root of a word can show up in different forms. And if you want to take it to the next level, you can examine prefixes and suffixes and demonstrate how those inflections carry meaning.
Like represent, representation, representative, but also inflectional morphemes like represented, representing, right? The conjugation of that verb.
Right.
These all serve a cognitive purpose of deepening learners' understanding of the word, attaching meaning to something else that sort of bootstraps them into understanding.
Right. Front loading is very helpful. But if I remember correctly, the research seems to show that the teacher providing all of the information is less effective. Instead, having the learners go on a scavenger hunt for the words they need to learn, having them work through them and think about them more deeply, that kind of cognitive engagement with a word is most helpful to retention.
Yeah. What was the name of that hypothesis?
The involvement load hypothesis.
Yes.
Ask students to go out and figure out how a word is used, a word they recognize the need for. So they look it up in a dictionary, figure out how and where it's most commonly used. The idea is that students are able to retain more unfamiliar words when they're required to do more with the words themselves.
Yeah. So teaching students how to use a dictionary, either a physical copy or an online dictionary, is a great tool to give them that agency.
Mm-hmm. And once they know how to use a dictionary, the opportunities are endless, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something that I know people use a lot are vocabulary logs, where students keep a personalized list with definitions and examples of unfamiliar words that they're learning.
Yeah, vocabulary logs can look different depending on what you're trying to accomplish, right? Like a vocabulary log could include words that a teacher introduces, the ones that she says, these are the words you need to know. Or alternatively, a vocabulary log could include words that the student decides to explore.
Or the students could contribute to a shared vocabulary log, which the teacher then uses to focus their attention on words she deems most useful.
Yes.
What I like about this interpretation of the vocabulary log, that is the one in which students select the words that they want to explore, is that it feels more meaningful for them because, well, not everyone likes being told what to do, right? Also, this process maintains a structure that the teacher puts forth, a template for exploration, and the students are given the responsibility of gathering information within those parameters.
Right. There needs to be a structured approach, even if the students are selecting their own inclusions. This reminds me of that living dictionary assignment that I had my students do on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
This was a while back, but each week students would have to select a new word to learn, do all of the work to ensure that they knew what it meant, different parts of speech it could appear, and how it could be used in context. And they would create a post on Instagram sharing the definition, part of speech, and an original sentence using the word in the caption of the post. Then they would share their findings with their peers by using a course-specific hashtag.
Yeah, I loved your living dictionary idea so much that I started doing it in almost all of my classes, and I still do years later. Students really enjoy seeing what words their peers are learning. I've tried it with Instagram, Facebook groups, and most recently, Flipgrid.
Mm-hmm.
And in all of the iterations, students had to create sentences using the word, and then their peers had to review their words and create their own sentences. That way, they gain exposure to more words and end up with a really cool class compilation at the end of the term.
Okay, so really cool class compilation. It's relative. I don't know if they think it's cool. But anyway, I think
you got me on that one.
I think that in any vocabulary log kind of activity, it's a question of quality of understanding versus quantity of terms. Is your objective breadth or depth? I think you have to be careful to ensure that they're not just memorizing words and their definitions.
You're so right. Knowing a bunch of words at the surface level doesn't hold as much power as having a deep understanding of how fewer words function. That's why I think it's so important that in addition to seeing how words are used in other contexts, students have a chance to actually create context for the words they're processing.
Yeah, one of my favorite activities for that is, and I mean, it's really simple. Instead of an asynchronous activity like Living Dictionary, in class, I just take 10 minutes at the beginning to review words in a shared vocab log. So I have each student take charge of a word or a group of words and then write their own sentences for them, then share with the group. Oh gosh, I remember this one vocab log I had going on in Quizlet one semester. And at one point, I put the students into teams and they had to choose 4 or 5 words from the log and write a paragraph that actually made sense with all of them. They came up with some really funny paragraphs and they got super competitive.
That's super fun. Another one that you and I have talked about is fill in the bleep. So students have to write a sentence with a word and then share that sentence with everyone else, but replacing the word with bleep or some other funny sound. So for example, the word, I don't know, unintelligible.
Okay, random.
Yeah, well, I would assign unintelligible to you and you would make a sentence like the teacher's handwriting was unintelligible. Instead of that, you'd say the teacher's handwriting was bleep, whatever sound.
So basically a more fun version of fill in the blank, but it requires the students to come up with the sentence, the context for the word themselves. Much, much more interesting than a regular close activity.
Yeah. And hopefully with that kind of practice, they'll be able to use the word spontaneously in the future in context that makes sense.
And let me emphasize that the importance of context. Looking at lexical items in isolation only gets you so far when words shift in shape and meaning so much.
So we need to understand the surrounding language and also how the combination of certain words changes their meaning, how they collocate. So, like a phrasal verb, the word hang versus hang out, totally different meanings.
Yeah. Or when I was younger, I used to say, I slept so hard. And everyone would think I was saying it weird, and it was weird. But the more accepted version of this is I slept deeply. But I mean, why is that?
Yeah, it's super confusing, right? The problem with teaching collocations is that it relies on what sounds right for native speakers of the language. Often there isn't a rhyme or reason that some word combinations just don't work. They just don't. And so learning and using collocations effectively relies on memorization, or at least constant exposure to natural conversation.
Exactly. Only certain words collocate. And in many cases, especially with those phrasal verbs, the meaning can change a lot. So it's important to be wary of that when teaching.
Yeah. So showing students how a word collocates gives them more options for incorporating it into their own use. The exploration of collocations creates a much more robust understanding of the word itself and allows a learner to produce more language related to the concept.
Actually, and this works better with higher intermediate or advanced students, but I like to use some corpus linguistics to get students thinking about how words are used rather than their surface definition. For example, if you go to the COCA website, COCA is the Corpus of Contemporary American English, you can search a word and then it'll bring up all these examples in context, plus highlight for you what other words naturally co-occur with that word with different colors for different parts of speech. So for example, you can search the word hierarchy and it comes up with several examples, plus highlights in green all of the adjectives that might come before it, like socioeconomic hierarchy. It takes some time to figure this tool out, but once you understand it, you might be able to introduce it to your students.
Yeah, I've tried introducing my students to COCA in the past. Maybe it's just that my level of comfort is not where it should be to try to introduce it to students, but I've gotten feedback that it's not user-friendly and it can be a bit overwhelming, even for those students who are at higher levels. So instead, I always introduce collocation dictionaries, which tend to be a bit more streamlined, at least for their purposes.
Yeah, you have to find what works for you.
Indeed. So teachers, we want to hear what works for you. What student outcomes do you strive for when teaching vocabulary? Do you find that you rely on implicit or explicit strategies more for teaching vocab? And what factors do you consider in deciding? What are your most trusted and creative strategies for teaching vocabulary?
You can join the conversation on our various social media accounts. Email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or comment via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
We do. And for more resources related to today's topic, take a look at our website and our podcast anchor page, anchor.fm/teacherthinkaloud.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.